All right, let's talk about the other side of the ledger overall, not just economically, but in general. Let's talk about the view that has become a thing in the last 15 or so years that maybe non-native species aren't so bad. So this view started with a set of biologists, Mark Davis, Dov Sachs, Martin Schlepper, and it was sort of a backlash, I think, to this view that we just take it for granted that invasive species or non-native species are bad without kind of examining why that is and what we mean by that. And so this paper by Mark Davis and others in 2011, Don't Judge a Species by its source or by where it lives or where it came from. It's a species. It's a reading I'll give to you for this reading for this lecture. Just making the point that, maybe this idea that having something from somewhere else come and live in a new place isn't something we should have this knee-jerk reaction where, oh, that's bad, we have to do something about it. Maybe we ought to take a step back and think about this in terms of, by their point of view, mostly, what is really happening that's bad. And then, another step there being, well, why do we consider these things bad? But so let's look at the positive aspects, though. One is just that, like, a lot of good science has come out of the fact of invasive species and then, the study of invasive species. And so this has a lot to do with understanding dispersal, understanding things like the genetics of founder effects, understanding colonization and, new interactions and new ecosystems. So, all kinds of terms have been coined like novel ecosystems. And this has just helped us learn a lot about evolutionary and ecological processes. So it's been, this continuing fountain of learning about our world. So that would certainly be seen by scientists as a positive thing. Another two aspects I've kind of put together here: ecosystem health and conservation. I've said before, I don't really understand what ecosystem health is. I think it has something to do with this human effect of the ecosystem being in a way that we think it's behaving how it should. Somewhere in there, I think there's a view that it could benefit humans somehow. But this involves, just like this conservation idea I'm going to talk about, it involves taking this invasive species and asking, well, is it actually working in a way that's positive for these things? And so a good example from the Southwest here is this the idea of tamarisk, this invasive tree that comes in and displaces some native vegetation and grows like a weed, and you see it does a lot better in drought conditions than a lot of other trees do. And so, okay, it's here, we got to get rid of it because it's an invader. But turns out this tree is a great refuge for an endangered protected bird, the willow flycatcher. And so now it's like, well, wait a minute. This is exactly the sort of thing that people do, trying to help things that we're trying to protect. We'll sometimes bring in a different species or alter the ecosystem so that the species we want to protect is doing better. Now, this invader that we didn't want and ostensibly is a bad thing is helping this species that we're trying to protect and may end up being largely responsible for, a comeback of this species where it does well. You can also make arguments that this is a tree that's fulfilling a role that was needed in this ecosystem. That would be the ecosystem health angle, where it's circulating the water in a way that was helpful to the ecosystem's health and whatever, if you perceive it that way. So these are benefits that are not, you don't have to twist and turn to call these benefits. These are things that conservationists would consider benefits and things that a lot of just normal people would consider benefits. And these are coming from these so-called bad invasive species. the aesthetic aspect. And so, aesthetic having some part of being, so aesthetics being the study of beauty, aesthetic appearance, or composition being, something that's beautiful. And we could think of that in more than one way. The obvious way would be just pulchritude, attractiveness. It looks good. So like this peacock, which is not native to this area, the hotel grounds where it's walking there, but also in the sense that there's those of us who like biodiversity like to see a lot of species in different places. Miami is one of my favorite places to go and look for herps, because the fauna there is so fantastic, and I find it aesthetically pleasing to be able to see all these different lizard species in the same place. And so, there's some positives where you're contributing something that most people would find beneficial. Not that everybody likes to have a lot of lizards in the area, but biodiversity is something that people would support. Economic aspects. This is again one of those situations where it's like, okay, the invasive species are bad until they really help us. And so this is a nice study in Kenya that's looking at the non-native freshwater fish and how much they contribute to local economies. And so that graph at the bottom is showing the financial catch value, an actual dollar amount that people are getting from these non-native fish, and it's substantial. It's a big deal. So this is really helping humans in a very direct way, in a way that everybody thinks about and cares about. You can argue with me about whether aesthetics should matter or not here, but very few people will argue that, it's so important that we don't have the invaders there that we have to forego these huge economic gains we're getting. And then the point we made at the end of the kind of bad things of biodiversity is this idea, or excuse me, bad things of invasive species was this idea that invasive species often, and usually in fact, are increasing the biodiversity of an area. And if we just think biodiversity is good, then we have to accept that as a good thing. The advocating for why that isn't good means that you're advocating for some particular kind of biodiversity that then would require, some additional argument there. Okay, so this is a survey paper by a group that looked at, they did a literature survey looking at invasive alien species and the communities in sociological production landscapes. So it's places where people live, and then asking, do they fulfill positive roles? And so they took this set of there was a paper not that long ago that says, okay, here we need to enumerate the positive things that biodiversity does, the positive things that species do, the positive things of the natural world. And so it listed these things like helping the habitat, or giving a positive experience for people, or a food source. And so this group that did this survey took these aspects from this independent paper, wasn't geared towards invasive species, and they applied it to these species that people would call invasive, and then tallied it out. And you can see this is a sort of an almost literal ledger here, where the undesirable effects are in bar graphs on the left and the desirable ones are on the right. And you can see they're pretty much, they're canceling out. There's a lot of positive things that are happening due to these invasive species. All right, so that is it for our general treatment of invasive species. What I'd like to do to finish with is to just talk a bit about so you can see that there is actual research that goes on in this field. Talk about some work that we've done in my lab. So we'll just finish with a short treatment of this. I will give you your reading, and then you'll be ready to go for this section. All right, I'd like to finish by talking to you a little bit about some work that I've done on invasive species that I think illustrates this idea of studying invasive species, not just for their own sake, which is very interesting in and of itself, but studying them as a way to understand the evolutionary processes that have shaped the biodiversity that we have today. So just starting with the impetus for doing this kind of science is, for me, I've mentioned Florida a number of times during this talk. I've mentioned it as the place I really like to go and catch lizards. This All-American Park is a tiny park in a rich part of Miami, and it includes, a couple species from Cuba, a couple species from Hispaniola. It has a species from Puerto Rico, and then its own, native form there as well. And it's a neat illustration of kind of when people feel positively about these species. Because I've been there in that park, looking for lizards, and I've had people in the community come over and be like, what are you doing? Don't take our lizards, because they care about them there. But for me, it was, seeing something like this was a real motivation for looking at these issues I'm going to tell you about. So let me just start with the questions here. And first question is just, so some of this, we have to establish some things about invasive species before we can make the comparisons we want to make evolutionarily. We want to ask whether naturalized species share unusual traits. So this is an important step. This is showing that the things that are able to invade an area tend to share certain traits. The idea being, there are probably some traits that allow this set of species to be good colonizers. There are some 20 species of anoles that have invaded that makes this a really good system for looking at this kind of thing. Second, we want to ask the same question, but this time about things that have invaded over evolutionary time. So if we rewind the tape of life and go back and reconstruct our ancestral states, we can ask, okay, how about the species that colonized millions of years ago? Do they share a suite of unusual traits? Again, maybe they have some conditions that help them to invade. And then the final two questions, they each get their own slide because they're the interesting ones more so. Are ancient colonizers similar to recent invaders? So, if we show that exotic species are similar to each other, exotic invaders are similar to each other, and we show that ancient evolutionary invaders are similar to each other, it's another step to show, are those two groups similar to each other? If they are, then that would tell us that the invaders over evolutionary time can actually tell us about and predict who's going to invade during modern times. We also asked that question about assemblages, so groups of species living in the same area. There's a lot of places where you can go and find multiple species of Anolis, up to about 12 in a same small area, just like you can find multiple species of Anoles in that park in Miami. And then there's a bunch of other places like that park in Miami where you can find multiple invading species together. So these last two questions, the most interesting ones, what are the implications of a yes or a no answer to these? If we find out that the ancient colonizers aren't similar to the recent invaders, same way if we find that the modern assemblages are different from ancient assemblages, we could probably infer that human interactions are a really important aspect of what species get where and where those species can coexist. That would be an interesting result. More interesting would be if we can say yes, the ancient invaders are similar to recent ones, or if the recent assemblages are structured like ancient ones, then the same kinds of things are invading today that invaded way back when. Same kind of communities are forming or assemblages are forming, and this may tell us that humans, even though they're clearly accelerating things, they're just accelerating the same things happening. They're not making different things happening, just in this case. And this question was really kind of codified by this philosopher. Well, he's a policy guy, but he also does some environmental philosophy. Mark Sagoff, who just died a couple years ago, asks whether ecologists can tell which is which, a native versus a non-native area, just by examining the two species or the two systems and their species without knowing their history. Is there any biological aspect that could tell you that these are different? The idea being that, if you can't tell your corrupted or disrupted or a problem community from one that's not a problem, then your vitriol directed towards that towards the bad community is really misplaced. Okay, let's just start with some data. We measured 242 species of Anolis. It's about, at the time of this paper, there's about 350 species, so a good sample, and a lot of just basic traits, like the length of the body and whether males are bigger than females, and the length of the head and the length of the hind limbs and things like this. All these things have some functional link to them. Limb length being attached to like what kind of habitat you can use and how fast you can run, and scale size being, do you desiccate faster or slower and things like that. Our sample of assemblages included 137 that would be considered natural. That is, they don't have any invasive species in them. And then 30 of them are ones that had the preponderance of non-native species, so at least 2 non-native species in them. So I don't want to spend much time on methods because some of them would take some explaining. But so this is a result where you can look at those p-values. Lower is better. It indicates that there are differences between naturalized species and species that have not colonized. And so this is that study of, okay, are naturalized species an unusual set? Do they share characteristics? And they certainly do. Okay, they have fewer scales across the snout, greater sexual size dimorphism, they're bigger, and they're native to lower elevations, and so on and so on. So there's a suite of traits that they share. We found that if you use this information to make an equation, build a model that predicts who's going to invade, you can back use that on the original data and say, okay, it actually does really well. So some 94% of the time, it can tell you invading or non-invading species with that level of accuracy. All right, let's switch over to looking at the ancient colonizers. So you have this, so the species that we used as colonizers were these solitary anoles. So most of the time, anoles live in an area with a bunch of other species. But 17 times they have colonized an area, and so clearly colonized it, not vicariance, where they're just there on their own. So that's a really easy and clear case of colonization. And so we have here, as I mentioned, 17 independent evolutionary transitions to solitary existence. So a lot of times in the Caribbean, small islands off of the main islands, and then some islands off of Central America as well. So doing the same types of analyses that we did with the invaders, we find that solitary species of Anolis share a suite of unusual traits as well. So just looking at them together, they also have larger sexual size dimorphism. They also have larger head scales. So they're also sharing this suite of morphological traits that means that, when you see an anole, you can predict whether that, would have been a good colonizer. So far, then we've established here that naturalized species are a group that we can tell apart from non-naturalized. Ancient colonizers are a group that we can tell differently to be different from species that didn't colonize. So, next question, our number 3 is whether ancient colonizers are similar to the recent invaders. Again, kind of skipping over the methods. This is a randomization test that I came up with that could show that in this case, if you're comparing the solitary anoles to the naturalized anoles, you see similarity. So they have a smaller number of head scales, that is bigger head scales, so 7.3 and 7.1 versus 8.6. Both groups have significant sexual size dimorphism, where the males are a lot bigger than the females. So you have similarity between these two groups. A neat way to visualize that is to build a model for the historical invaders to compare to the model for recent invaders. And so you can take each species, whether it's an invader anciently or recently or not at all, run it through that model to get both scores and get this graph. So this graph, the fact that it's sloping up like that, is showing that things that are predicted to be good ancient colonizers are also things that are predicted to be good recent colonizers. So that strong positive relationships indicates that, the ancient colonizers are predicting the recent colonizers and vice versa. Okay, let's look at the comparison of assemblages here. First, let's ask, what is an assemblage, just to get kind of caught up together. So it's a group of similar species living sympatrically. In our case, it's species in the same genus, the Anolis. There's a lot of famous and well-studied assemblages of anoles. Saroa Cuba, people have done a bunch of community studies there, the 12 species that share space there. El Cope, Panama, the 12 species there, mainland sites beginning to be well studied. And then, of course, that All-American Park I mentioned, where you have an assemblage there, but most of that assemblage is non-native and coming from at least 4 different sources there. And just to show you the kinds of measures we're using here, again, I'm not going to delve too deep into methods, but when we're talking about comparing to assemblages, one way we can compare them is their morphological structure across species. So SD here stands for standard deviation. That's a measure of how spread out the data are. So if we have 4 species here that have lengths that are very different, 66, 144, 81, 42, you have a high standard deviation for body length. If they all have similar body lengths, 66, 77, 64, then that standard deviation is low. And so you can compare those numbers across the exotic assemblages versus the native assemblages. Another thing you can look at in comparing assemblages is the phylogenetic structure. In the same way that you can measure the dispersion of a morphological trait, you can measure phylogenetic dispersion. If things are very distantly related, like we see on the left here, you can get a high score for dispersion. It seems things are very closely related with that tree where my face is blocking the things that are all in the same clade there. You get a low score. And so if both natural assemblages and invaded assemblages have species from lots of different places in the phylogeny, then we will score them as similar. And we find that by those morphological comparisons, that both natural and non-native assemblages are significantly similar in their morphological dispersion. In fact, they are both clustered according to, so PC1 here, PC2, PC3, those are composite measures of morphology. So you can think of them as body size, limb length. Both natural and non-native assemblages, the species in the assemblage tend to be similar to each other. So that says that maybe there's some sort of filtering mechanism that allows them to be in this place or something like that. The point for our purposes is that, yes, the assemblages that have been formed in just human history are very much like the assemblages of ancient times. We find that natural and non-native assemblages differ in their degree of phylogenetic dispersion. And that really occurs because the native species tend to be really phylogenetically closely related. And both are clustered, both natural assemblages and non-native assemblages, both sets are clustered. That is, they both have close phylogenetic relatives. It's just that the natural assemblages have even closer, especially close phylogenetic relatives. Okay, so let me summarize this work. We've shown that naturalized species of Anolis share these unusual traits of morphology. That's the results I talked about. In the original paper, we also showed that they were similar in phylogeny and distribution. So naturalization is predictable in Anolis. You can show me a species of anole, an individual anole. I can tell you whether that's going to be good at going to a new place and surviving. Second, the solitary species of Anolis, these ancient colonizers, much like the modern colonizers, they share a set of traits. They are similar to each other. Then we put those things together and find that ancient colonizers are similar to the recent invaders. We also showed information that ancient and recent assemblages are similar in their morphological dispersion. They're similar in their direction of phylogenetic clustering, but not to their degree. And those last 2 points basically uphold or answer Sagoff's question in the negative. You can't tell these assemblages apart. If I take you blindfolded to a new assemblage and you don't know the history of it, you can't tell me whether it's an invaded assemblage or not, just based on looking at the structure, looking at the things that we have. Okay, so the implications for this. One, it's not necessary to invoke human interactions to explain which species invade. Nothing that we did in here talked about the relationship of these species to humans. It was all about the relationship to each other and then to the ancient invaders. Modern invasions can be looked at as accelerated natural colonizations rather than as something fundamentally distinct, something different going on than that was going on years ago. It looks like that what's going on today with invading anoles is the same thing that's been going on for millions of years with invading anoles. The same kinds of things can go to a new place. And that's where we can get this idea of a colonizing type of anolis that is colonizer today and a colonizing type also millions of years ago. Okay, finish up by telling you about your reading on this. So this is all stuff that we've either referenced today or we've spent significant time on it. So the original pair of papers, so the Mark Davis paper, Don't Judge Species on Their Origins. So that was a big deal when it came out. Attracted a lot of attention. Wait a minute, we thought non-native species are bad, now you're telling us they're okay? What? And it was such a big deal that Daniel Simbaroff, who is a longtime opponent of non-native species, got a bunch of his friends together and wrote a paper signed on by another 140 scientists saying that actually no, you're being misled by this paper, invasive species are actually bad. I'm going to give you another paper that looks at this idea of even talking about things in terms of alien versus native isn't appropriate. That's the Warren paper. And then Sagoff talking about how the evidence for calling these things bad just isn't compelling. So the evidence for deciding that invasive species, non-native species in particular, are bad, it doesn't work. And that's where, remember that Sagoff's rule of can you tell these invaded or non-invasive communities apart. And then I think what probably will be your best reference here is the one by Dov Sachs and others, Fact and Value in Invasion Biology. And this talks a lot, or this one discusses the positive contributions of invasive species, non-native species, and making sure that we look at not just the negative side of the ledger with invaders, but also the positive side. All right. So that's it. This is Jackson's chameleon in Hawaii that I caught that ended up on this grading. He was fine. That's it, and we'll talk next time about environmental philosophy. We'll see ya.